Good morning and welcome to What is True. I'm Don Patton. I preach for the Little Rock Church of Christ. We would refer you to our YouTube channel, which would have the back issues, if you please, the previous lessons that have been done for the past year by Brother Kara and myself that speak regularly on this program. We would encourage you to subscribe and have those tools available. I'll be speaking later today at the Little Rock Church of Christ. The services this morning are at 10:30 and then at 5 this afternoon. We meet also Wednesday evening at 7 o'clock. You can see the live streaming on Facebook Live or our Proverbs Live channel of YouTube. This morning we're talking about what I think is a very critical issue in the creation-evolution controversy. We're talking about the age of the earth. And I have a great many people who will say, well, it really doesn't make any difference how old the earth is, and I think that's a very naive view. Certainly the evolutionist understands and knows that if the earth is young, that's the death knell for evolution. Battle is over, you go home. You have to have the billions of years. And of course, a great many, including scientists, believe in billions of years for the age of the earth. But not all of them do. It is certainly essential to the faith of the evolutionist. But there are thousands of highly credentialed, credible scientists who believe that the evidence is strongly in favor of a young earth. One example would be Dr. Russell Humphreys, who is a geophysicist, his PhD from LSU, was at Sandia National Laboratory for over 30 years. I recently heard him make a presentation where he listed over 12 items that are clear indications of a young age of the earth. He is convinced that 90% is the way he put it, of all of the indicators of the age of the earth indicate a young earth, and the 10 remaining percent are not very good arguments. That's what we're going to focus on this morning, the 10%, the things that are supposed to prove the earth is old. And I think we'll see that the very opposite is the case. To get an idea of the significance, the philosophical aspects of this, I think, are critical. Notice the statement by George Wald, who's a Nobel laureate from Harvard. He says one only has to contemplate the magnitude of this task, and the task he's talking about is the origin of life. And what we've learned about the origin of life is that it's just more complex than certainly Darwin ever began to start to imagine. It's more like, instead of protoplasm jelly in a membrane, it's more like New York City in the cell, where we have literally trillions of molecules organized into millions of proteins, each analogous to a factory, functioning together. Millions of factories functioning in the simplest cell. So you only have to contemplate the magnitude of this task, he says, to concede that spontaneous generation of a living organism is impossible. Now, this is the Nobel laureate who certainly believes that it happened naturally. He's an atheist. But look at it. To say that happened is impossible. Yet, here we are, he says, I believe as a result of spontaneous generation. It's impossible, but he believes it. Well, that sounds crazy, but he goes on to say, however improbable we regard this event, or any of the steps which it involves, given enough time, it will almost certainly happen at least once. And so, this is the solution. You throw time in it. Time is the hero of the plot. He says, given so much time, the impossible becomes possible. Now, here's the miracle worker. The possible becomes probable, the probable virtually certain. Time itself performs the miracles. the Holy Spirit of the evolutionist, if you please. Well, what we learned about time in previous lessons indicates things degenerate with time. This is from our own experience. As time goes on, things don't get more organized, they get more disorganized. We see deterioration and degeneration, the rule. But he has to believe this in order to support his religion of atheism. In fact, earlier he made a statement more blatant in Scientific American. He says, I'm a supernatural, creative act of God. He says that is what he rejects. I will not accept that philosophically, not scientifically, but I won't accept it because I do not want to believe in God. Therefore, I choose to believe in that which is scientifically impossible. Spontaneous generation arising to evolution. Because he doesn't want to believe in God. This is not a scientific issue. This is a religious issue with him. Now, that was back in 1954. Certainly, people are more sophisticated today, and we see Eugene Conant, who is perhaps the most representative evolutionary biologist today, senior investigator for the National Center for Biochronology Information. Certainly a leading representative. And he says the same thing, but in more sophisticated language. He says, despite considerable experimental and theoretical effort, now this is what science is about, and it's despite that, no compelling scenarios currently exist for the origin of replication, translation, the key processes that together complete the core biological systems and apparent prerequisites for biological evolution. Now, he uses bigger terms and more complicated sentences, but he says, despite what we see in experiments, we can't make it work, even on paper. No scenarios for the core systems of biological systems, that is, in terms of natural origin. But there's a way out, and this is his terminology, a way out of this conundrum, an infinite multiverse. Not just, it won't happen in this universe, but if you got an infinite number of universes, which is not about science, this is not even good science fiction, but you imagine an infinite number of universes with infinite number of distinct macroscopic histories, each repeated an infinite number of times. The emergence of even highly complex systems by chance is not just possible, but inevitable. So, no, you can't do it in our universe, but you just multiply the universes, an infinite number of universes, infinite time, and this is the way you solve the problem. And I would say it's not about science. It's in spite of science that you imagine scenarios that overcome that which points inevitably to a supernatural origin. Most of us have heard the fairy tale of the princess that kisses the frog, and boom, the frog turns into the prince. This is similar to what's being taught today. Time is the solution, you see. Then it's science. Yes, the frog turns into the prince. Given enough time, well, I don't think that's science. I don't think time has that magic capability. I think one of the ways to approach many scientific issues is to ask why questions. You believe the earth is old, all right, why do you think it's old? Well, when we ask that question, usually the response is involving radioactivity. We date a rock, it's billions of years old. Obviously, the earth is at least billions of years old since the rock dates billions of years. I can understand the thinking, though a lot of people have no idea what we're talking about when we're talking about radioactive processes. It's not about the dating a lot of our teenagers are interested in. And we won't try to make physicists out of you this morning and geochronologists, but I think we can get a basic idea of what's going on, and we have to do that in order to understand the problems. This would represent the nucleus of radioactive material. usually very complex, heavy atoms, that begin to lose part of the particles, emitting alpha and beta particles. They're not stable. They begin to emit, and in that emission process, they decay through a series of elements finally down to a stable form. And that process, we're told, allows us to tell time much like an hourglass. You begin with the material at the top, like uranium-238, and you wind up through a series of elements finally down at, with lead at 206 elements or particles in the nucleus. From 238 to 206, you lose 32 particles and wind up with lead, which is stable. Now, there's naturalistic lead that occurs, it looks the same, and then radiogenic lead, and you can't really tell the difference. But that's what winds up as a result of the decay process. Now, what could go wrong with this kind of a process? You follow the formula that you see at the bottom to reach the conclusion about time. If you look at this, suppose it were laying on its side, just like this, and you stand it up, and this is an hourglass, and someone says, all right, how long has this been going on? And you look at the hourglass and you say, well, maybe 12, 15 minutes, and it's been 12, 15 seconds because it was like that to start with. You got to know the beginning conditions, that there was nothing at the bottom, and radiogenic lead occurs as a result of the process. Also, it occurs naturally, and so you got to know the difference, and you make some assumptions about the beginning conditions. If someone, just before you looked to make your conclusion, had lifted the top and poured extra sand in, that would skew the conclusion. Or if they lowered the base and let what had almost all reached the bottom out so that it doesn't look like that, that would skew it. You got to know that nothing leaked in and nothing leaked out in order for this to tell time. And that's the kind of problem that we see in many of the radiometric systems. Henry Fall, who's chairman of the Department of Geology at the University of Pennsylvania, writing in a book on this subject, says two important assumptions are implicit in this equation, the equation we saw at the bottom. First, that we're dealing with a closed system. Nothing leaked in, nothing leaked out. Second, that no atoms of the daughter, that's what's produced at the bottom, in this case lead, were present in the system when it formed. So you got to know the beginning conditions. You got to know that it's a closed system. He says these assumptions furnish the most serious limitations on the accumulation clock. He acknowledges these are assumptions. You say, all right, this rock was dated, and it is. The conclusion is not stamped on the rock. It's not what the rock is saying. It's through a number of assumptions that are not necessarily valid assumptions that you reach that conclusion. He continues to say closed systems probably do not exist in nature. Now, you've got to have closed systems to tell time, and they don't exist in nature. And we know that, especially over long periods of time. A seashell sinks to the bottom and over a period of time becomes fossilized as water percolates through and adds some material, takes other material out. It becomes pyrite. It's something totally different as the particles are. That's not a closed system. And it's demonstrated with the fossilization process. They don't exist. But he continues, many minerals and rocks satisfy the requirement well enough to be useful for nuclear age determination. The problem is one of judicious geologic selection. You select the ones that work, you judicially unselect the ones that don't work. And if that sounds like I'm a little biased in my description, let's just allow the evolutionist to describe how that works. Here's one of the examples that's given in Roger Lewin's book. He's a friend of Leakey, who had discovered the 1470 skull that we see pictured here. And they were trying to date this at Cambridge. In fact, they knew there were problems with some of the systems, and they waited several months so they can get the new, up-to-date, best system But notice his description of what happened. The calculated age was quickly refined to be 2.61 plus or minus 0.26 million years, which to anthropologists unfamiliar with the procedures of radiometric dating, now you don't have to feel deprived if you're unfamiliar with the procedures of radiometric dating. Many anthropologists don't. They just send it to the lab and say, what's the date? And of course they have to tell them the date they want before they will do the test. Now, as I was in school, I didn't have to have the answers before I took the test. That's kind of cheating. But that's the way the labs work, and they will not accept it unless you tell them what you expect. Anyway, this has a ring of comforting precision about it. 2.61 plus or minus 0.26 million years. Then he says there were 41 separate age determinations that varied between 223 million and 1.91, less than 1 million, all the way to 220. These dates are all over the place, a huge range. After the first determination, they never again got 2.61, but that's the one they judiciously selected and tossed 39 that were all over the place. Now, that's not science. That's just picking out what you want as a result, and it's an embarrassment. When you get the rest of the story, another illustration of the problems would be seen here at this at Mount St. Helens, where in the center of the caldera, the dye-base sill was dated with potassium argon. It was of known origin. It actually was formed in 1986, 6 years after the explosion, this particular section. So we took samples from this dye-base sill in the middle. 5 samples were taken in 97 that were formed in 86, and we sent them to the UCLA potassium argon lab. 11 years old, and the lab tells us that it's somewhere between 500,000 to almost 3 million years old, and we know that it's only 11 years old. Now, this is sort of the proof of the pudding type argument. You know the age. Well, most of the time you don't know the age of the Earth. You know what, if you're an evolutionist, you want it to be, and you have to tell them what you want it to be, and then it comes back that age, or if it doesn't, you toss it and you try again. Now, I don't think this is much of a threat to someone who doubts the conclusion. We see good reason for doubt. Radiocarbon is probably the system that we hear the most about, though it's probably least significant overall in terms of evolution because it covers a much shorter period of time. This is detectable only for tens of thousands, well, maybe 50,000 years. At the end of 50,000 years, it's gone, and most of the processes of evolution take much longer than that. But if you have something that dates at 30,000 years old, if it turns out to be that many years, I think that's a threat to what we see described in Scripture. And we had a lesson on the scriptural age of the earth that you can see on Facebook last Wednesday evening. Several creation scientists decided to test the proposition with a project that was called the RATE project, and they dated a number of dinosaur fossils with carbon-14 as well as coal and diamonds, which are supposed to be millions, hundreds of millions of years old. The dinosaurs at least 65 million. Well, now wait a minute. Radiocarbon would all be gone within 50,000 years, and these are millions, hundreds of millions. Well, there should be no radiocarbon there at all. Yes, and so why would you try to date it? Well, maybe it's not that old. And if you find radiocarbon in it in significant amounts, then radiocarbon would be saying it's not more than 50,000 years old. All of the dates that we performed had significant amounts of carbon-14, over 100 dinosaur bones, all dated with significant amount, less than 50, usually about 30, 35, which I think is completely consistent. That's radiocarbon years, not actual years, and in view of what processes took place in the flood, which skewed the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14, is exactly what we would predict. But if it's got any, then it would clearly indicate it's thousands, not millions. So radiocarbon is plainly supporting the creationist position, not billions of years, but thousands of years, and this is true with diamonds, with coal, with fossils. This was done several years ago. Since then, literally hundreds of examples have been dated and published, and the evidence has been piling up and piling up, and finally, this year the roof is caved in, and there's the leading evolutionists have just given up on carbon-14. This is a quotation from February of this year, an American biology teacher by Philip Center. He's one of the most vicious anti-creationists in the country, has written dozens of articles and books published against creation science. But he has seen the published material that says there's all kinds of carbon-14 in the dinosaur bones, in the fossils, in the seashells that are supposed to be hundreds of millions of years old. And so he published that bone material, fossil or otherwise, is material that cannot yield an accurate radiocarbon date. Just give up. Do not even try to date bone material or fossils with radiocarbon. Now, why in the world? This is supposed to be evidence of the evolution and the great age. No. Don't even try. And the reason is interesting. Mesozoic bone, that's the bone where the dinosaurs are, consistently yields, it's falsely in his view, consistently yields a young radiocarbon date. Now, if you date it and it consistently comes out this way, and he doesn't really have exceptions, that's the way it works. So he knows that it's wrong because that's the wrong answer. It gives a few thousand to a few tens of thousands, not hundreds of millions or 60 million as required for the dinosaur. And so you just give up. Forget carbon-14. That's the new propaganda from the evolutionist. I think carbon-14 speaks very clearly and plainly of young age for these things, not the age that we're being told. And when it doesn't say the right age, they just give up on it. When you look at the, quote, absolute dating assumptions, first, that there's a closed system, and we know that that's not the way it works in the real world. When we know we don't know the beginning conditions, and we have questions about the rate, if it runs fast and then slow. We've observed just a few hundred years. We're going back millions where we haven't observed what was the rate. There's good reason to think the rate has varied, but that's a contested issue. We're working on it. There's some challenges, but it is a clear indication. Those are significant problems, and if those problems, any of them, are valid, then the radiometric systems aren't. When we look at known ages, like what we see in the caldera there at Mount St. Helens, when we look at carbon-14 that says these old things are not, then we see good reason to seriously, scientific reasons, to doubt their conclusions. W.D. Stanfield, who is a vicious anti-creationist, writing in his book Science of Evolution, says it's obvious that the radiometric technique may not be the absolute dating methods they're claimed to be. Now, this is what they're being forced to when they see conclusions they don't like. And so he says there is no absolutely long-term radiological clock, and I think he's correct. We have good reasons for seriously doubting that. Now, why do you think the earth is old? The first answer is not a real good answer. The next answer that we get, we're going to have to deal with in the next session, but usually it involves the radiometric that is the geologic phenomenon, not the radio. It looks old, and I think that's not really the case. As a geologist, I would say it doesn't look old. I think it looks flooded, and I think there are real good reasons for reaching that conclusion. In fact, when we see the same kind of sedimentary rock on Mars that we see on Earth, we see, according here to the New York Times, signs of a great flood on Mars. Scientists recognize the awesome magnitude of a deluge that swept over much of the red planet. Now, it's just as dry as it can be, but it was produced by catastrophe. Now, we'll have to look at more of the evidence here. I think we see on Earth, where 70% of the Earth's surface is covered by ocean, there's much more reason to think the flood water did this than on Mars, where there was nothing like that, or is not now. Join us next Sunday morning when we look at the rest of the evidence. I think you'll see some just really dramatic evidence, especially some that has come up just in the last months that make it absolutely impossible. We thank you for joining us this morning. I think these are critical issues. We hope you'll worship with us again at 10:30 at the Little Rock Church of Christ. Thank you for tuning in.